things off today with a panel on distributed team management. My name is Suzanne. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing here at Miro. My team is a globally distributed team. We are in 4 hubs with a 12-hour time zone spread. So I am particularly excited to dig into this topic with my panelists today, which includes Erin, Product Experience Director at Automattic, Jira, Senior UX Designer at Amazon, and Jeremy, VP of Product and Engineering at Base. Hi, panelists. Thanks for joining me. Let's do a quick roundtable and have you each tell us a little bit about yourselves and your teams. In true distributed fashion, we are all around the globe: Seattle, South Carolina, London. So let's start with you, Jira, in Seattle, and make our way over to Erin in London. Give us a quick introduction so that everyone learns a bit more about what your role looks like and how you're working on a distributed team.
Sure, thank you, Suze. Hello, everyone. I'm Jira Vincelli, a UX design veteran with experience in both startups and enterprise e-commerce software. I'm really passionate about effortless customer service experiences and have spent almost my entire career working in that field. But currently, I'm most excited about the way advances in machine learning technology are allowing customer service professionals to focus on the emotional, the behavioral elements of their job, and that whole let me put you on hold while I pull up your order routine is going to fall away. I believe the reward for work well done is the opportunity to do more, and that designers have a responsibility to leave the world better than we found it. So I'm presently working at Amazon as a design lead in worldwide CS. I have teammates in the US, Canada, India, Scotland, and Japan. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few. But today I'll be sharing with you lessons that I learned while working as a UX design manager for Vista Equity Partners, a venture capital firm where I managed a team of 6 designers in California, Texas, New York, and Belarus.
Great. Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah. So my name is Jeremy. I am the VP of Product and Engineering at a company called Base. Like Suzanne said, I am in the bustling metropolis of Greenville, South Carolina. I love the remote life, and like I said, so Base has the first software platform for executive assistants. So we're changing the way that EAs get work done. It's very exciting. We are a pre-seed startup, so there's 8 of us. I have 4 engineers distributed Thailand, San Francisco, South Carolina, Vietnam, so we're kind of all over the place. Prior to that, I spent about 4 years at a company called InVision. I was a product and engineering leader, and I had teams all over. So I was part of the growth. I was about, around 120 people when I joined, and left at about 800. So saw a lot of, we were kind of joking earlier about all the things that work and then break and work and then break. So I love working with distributed teams. I have worked with companies that are both all co-located with satellite offices and fully distributed. And right now I'm working in a fully distributed fashion and love it.
Great. And Erin?
Hello. Yes, I'm Erin Casali. I work as the Product Experience Director for Automattic, which is not very known, but we are the company behind WordPress.com, Jetpack, WooCommerce, and since a few weeks ago, also Tumblr. And I don't have a ranking, but I think we're still probably the largest fully distributed company in the world with over 1,200, I think, people. And we cover pretty much every time zone in the globe. And specifically, I lead the division, the design of this division, but specifically a design team that is spread 11 time zones apart, which is a very interesting challenge to have. And yeah, I'm happy I've given a lot of talks about how to make company distributed, how to transition from distributed to remote, to remote to distribute, and so on. So happy to be here.
And obviously one of the perks of remote meetings is using filters on video calls. I love that. All right, so let's jump into some of the questions. A critical piece of creating and managing high performance teams is employee engagement. With employees in offices around the globe, it can be a lot more challenging to establish and maintain this sense of shared culture or team unity. At the very least, as we know, this requires a little bit more of a proactive effort. So Jira, I'd love to ask you about your experience with this. I know that you've also managed a team during mergers and acquisition. How do you go about making everyone feel like they're a part of the same team?
Thanks. Yeah, critical is the right word for it. I'm going to talk about my experience as a design manager building a UX team during a merger with subsequent acquisitions as something from my time with Vista Equity Partners in 2016. So I think in a mergers and acquisition situation, you do have the advantage of people coming together to form something new or redefine something old. And there's something really special about starting that journey together and the ability to earn trust from the beginning as you set a direction and forge a path. I think the way to do this is through crafting a shared identity and distributing ownership because it's easier to accept change when you're part of defining it. As a leader, this is your opportunity to reimagine your team's norms and mechanisms. So I think asking them what worked and what didn't work in other roles and past teams, kind of what they want to bring to this new thing that you're forming, and just to see where there are expectations and assumptions about the way things should be. When you do that, when you interview people to surface their specific expectations, you'll find things around communication, collaboration, sponsorship, and what they believe about hierarchy. So if possible, include a little something for each person in your new culture. And I think it's important that everyone gets a piece of that merger pie. Like your most senior employee could own the end-to-end system integration. Those kind of mid-career professionals can drive the redesign of components and workflows, all the way down to junior or associate designers, getting to make sure things like all the new logo images have all screen reader accessible alt tags. And the point here, what matters is that every team member gets to own and drive some part of building this new shared identity. Now, on identity, some of the ways that we signal identity is through the symbolism that we display, the signage that fills our environments, and the language that we use with our peers is really important too. So there's this concept called in-group lingo. It's vocabulary that's specific to a certain group or a group of people or a subject. And we see this a lot among video gamers and sports fans. What they're doing is replacing complex concepts with standalone words, and then they're using the simplified version of that as a shorthand for something that everyone in the group is aware of or bought in on, and you start to build this culture there that way. We can leverage this, it's a natural human behavior, and on your team, the way you do it is just by defining the glossary of your ecosystem. And I think with distributed teams, what's really important here is to keep in mind that language as identity can be sensitive, and you're going to encounter linguistic nuances when your team lives around the world. So just get out in front of that by allowing the team to influence labels and definitions, because adoption of lingo comes when you've built this shared consensus and people believe that this term accurately represents them and they feel positively about using it. So I have some thoughts on shared imagery and relationships as well, Suzanne. Is it okay if I go into those too?
Yeah, go ahead. That'd be great.
Cool. So on the subject of symbolism and signage, think about visiting a Nike store, for example. When you go in, every employee is wearing the brand from head to toe. And for the most part, it's because they want to, not because they have to. They're really bought in on the idea that working there is part of their identity. And they feel this strong affiliation with the name and the logo. So as designers, we're often creating things like this, branded ephemera, like water bottles and all that stuff for our clients' marketing purposes. But I also think that teams get that same kind of value treating ourselves as an entity that also needs to have our purpose and persona reinforced. So I suggest putting together a swag bag for your new hires and the talent that you inherit through that merger or the acquisition, just to communicate all those things. Like at the very minimum, give everyone a t-shirt, a lanyard, like a notebook, a pen, and a sticker. And it's just stuff that people can keep at their desks and wear on their person. It's highly visual, so they're reminded by the colors and the logos and catchphrases that they're part of something bigger. And my final thought is that your teammates' relationships with each other are just as important as their relationship with you. Maybe even more so when two people's time zones overlap where yours doesn't. They can reach out to each other in a way that you might be inaccessible at that time. So I strongly encourage peers to have weekly one-on-one meetings with each other in addition to you, their manager, because this scales the flow of information and it allows for multi-directional feedback on a project or process. I think the truth is that when your team is distributed around the world, they don't just need a lifeline to you, they need a web of relationships with people who share the same purpose and use the same lingo and have adopted this shared identity to keep them feeling connected.
Definitely. Love the plus one. I love what you mentioned about shared language. I also think standardization in general, or creating sort of equal access to information or understanding, is really key here. How does that play a role in building shared culture at Automattic, Erin, or at Base, Jeremy? Do you have any thoughts on that, Erin, that you want to chime in on?
Yes. It's so going remote, and especially going distributed, has a weighting on the way you write text. So, for example, in our hiring process, we evaluate for people to write because that's part of the job at this point. Text has a lot of advantages, but the primary for this specific question is that it puts everyone on the same playing field. Because even not just for, of course, there is an advantage for accessibility purposes. Everyone can read text, or even with a text-to-speech converter. But at the same time, it allows heavily to be asynchronous. Because if I write something, it's there, and doesn't really matter if you're answering 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, or 24 hours later, right? So it helps a lot to create a more distributed cohesion across teams, across divisions, and even better if this is founded on a principle of transparency. A lot of companies silo themselves, sometimes just because the tool they choose does that. But if the company is open, they can write openly, and so it helps spreading the culture. And one thing I want to highlight before giving word to Jeremy is that often we think about writing and text across all our different tools as just functional. So there is surely a dimension that is, of course, we are here to work, right? So we are writing work stuff, but there is a really strong dimension, especially in more synchronous channels like Slack or any other chat tools, where there has to be some time spent to the personal side of things. So socialize more, say what you did the day before. So for example, one of the automation that some of our teams do is in the morning text stand-up, there is a question that is, do you want to add anything personal? And that can be very powerful because you start day after day after day, you're like, oh, they're interesting about this. Oh, they do this. Oh, and then you foster cohesion and, you know, that human level that sometimes, I mean, I get a lot of questions, how do you establish that human level? So yeah, that's one of the elements that help a lot.
First of all, Erin, the +1 sign, I'm stealing that. I'll give you credit in the future, but I'm gonna do that. I like that. First of all, I loved the way that Jerry talked about this. Even better. There's such like a design focus on that. Like you're talking about symbolism and like kind of that shared experience in that way. I love it. It just has such a unique perspective, one I totally wouldn't have thought of in the same way. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of what Erin was just hitting on there is when we think about fostering team across the distributed, across the distributed team, is that I really want to understand, and as much as people are invested in doing so, I want us to have connections, because if we were all co-located, we would naturally have some of those interactions which we don't naturally get to have in a distributed culture. And so it's almost like you have to come up with some tactics that almost feel unnatural if you were in a co-located experience. For example, some of the things that we've done, which I think have really been a lot of fun and really helped when we think about teams, is virtual coffee hours, virtual happy hours. And it's kind of like what Erin was saying is like, yeah, the donut chats, right? Like where you end up having these conversations and it's like, oh, you surf, or you like to paint, or I discovered that somebody made handmade rugs and they sell them on the site. It's like just you find out these rich things which ultimately lead to more human connections, which that Jer was talking about. You want people to be connected. You want this network of effect so that communication happens more naturally and so on and so forth. And like, there's just a shared empathy and trust. One of the things that was a bit weird when we started doing it, but I've had a lot of fun with is quarterly. We have we call it the breakfast, lunch, dinner. It's essentially like a distributed meal that we share across time zones within our team. So we try and find a time that kind of like hits generally one of those meal times for everyone and say, hey, go, expense it, go grab a meal somewhere and we're going to hang out. And like we would set up like a little board, like a Miro board, and throw up, a map of where that person is and some pictures of what they're eating and talk about it. Like, so, we had an engineer in Nigeria that was talking about like the food that they were eating there. And like, it's so interesting, right? When you get just these more human connections, ultimately it just forms these tighter bonds so that people understand that one, we actually care about each other as individuals, not just what we actually provide very tactically, even though that is a part of our job, right? Like we also bring ourselves, and understanding who we are helps us to work better together.
For sure. I think for us too at Miro, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I work with people 12 hours ahead, which means that quite literally when people are trying to get work done, others are completely unavailable and asleep. So that makes it challenging for many reasons to access the information you might need, as well as form human connection. So a couple of things we've done that I think work really well on my team are first, as a manager, putting a lot of work in up front on building out resources for your team, especially during onboarding. There, I think, have been some flashes of the onboarding template on the live note taking going on that I added, but this has been really helpful in helping onboard people in other offices, not only so that they have access to the resources and they know where they can dig in and get more information, but also so they know who their partners are. Put a lot of effort into identifying not only who's on your team as a sort of a functional organization, but who are my cross-functional partners? Who do I go to that might be in other departments so I can help navigate the organization and build those relationships while my manager might be unavailable. And the second thing that we have is this idea of a huddle board, so that even if these are people that are not on my team, anyone can come into the huddle board from outside of the team and understand who's working on what state is it in, how are we doing, what are the blockers, how can I help? So doing a lot of that like upfront documentation has really helped. And then on the human side, I love these ideas. And for us, it's been one really simple thing that's gone a long way, which is every Monday, everyone on the team posts just one picture of what they did over the weekend. And this idea came from some feedback I got from someone on my team named Olga, who was saying, I'm so motivated by the human element, feeling like personally connected to everyone on my team. There she is. And then we decided that, well, what's one way that we can establish a more human connection and build relationships and get to know each other outside of our working conversations? And this was a good way to just share, what do you do in your free time and what interests you, and also celebrate spending time away from the office and spending time away from Slack, because when you're working all the time, when you have people working 24/7, it's really easy to just make that the center of every conversation. And we felt like it was so important to celebrate things that people were doing for themselves outside of work. So that one picture has gone a really long way in helping us really get to know each other when we're all over the world. Let's talk about meetings a little bit. So meetings are a big part of building culture and alignment on teams that are co-located or distributed. They're hard if you're on a distributed team. Time zones are challenging. What is everyone's philosophy on meetings? What's your approach to making meetings effective? And what are the purpose of meetings in your opinion? How maybe it's different than experiences you've had with co-located teams. Jeremy, what's your perspective on meetings?
So I think it's an interesting segue of what we were just talking about. To me, when I think about meetings, I'm thinking primarily synchronous, right? Like some call that we're having together. One of the things I noticed when I first started managing remote teams is I had certain individuals who would not turn on their camera. And this is, maybe people might disagree with me, but I basically kind of set that as an expectation. Like, hey, on my teams, I'd like you, unless there's a reason why you can't, I want you to turn on your camera. And it's not because I'm trying to tell that you're working or anything like that. It's because we have, like, most of our communication is nonverbal, and we lose a lot of that not being physically present. and you gain a large percentage of the back with video. So being able to tell people's expressions, people that naturally tend to not speak up as much, you can actually kind of get a read and a sense of how they're engaging with the meeting and what's being said and what's being communicated and so on and so forth. But I think that meetings in a remote environment are as much about that connection to one another as they are about kind of knowledge and communication sharing. So, as Erin was talking about earlier, right, like so much of like the actual tactical communication of a thought can be done in text, and in some ways better in text, but a lot of that kind of shared feeling and understanding can't be communicated easily or super well over text. And so, for example, I love the idea of the picture that you guys talk about. So we have stand-ups more frequently, like physical meeting stand-ups 3 times a week, instead of doing all just asynchronous. But the primary reason is not for us to answer the 3 standard stand-up questions, right? It's actually much about that is having a shared sense of team and being able to, talk and say, how was your day? Like what did you do over the evening, right? Like those sorts of things. And there's actually explicit time built in for that. One of the directors of product at Envision, she coined this term, I love it, called human time. It's like, okay, this is human time. Like we're explicitly going to be using this time to just hang out and talk, and then we'll go on to tactical things and we'll make that change. But I love that idea that like there is a need, in my opinion, for some of that to take place so that we can work more effectively together.
Erin or Jira, any thoughts on meetings or how you've made them work? Critical meetings you feel like can't be replaced by asynchronous work?
So when we chatted, I had a strong perspective on this, and now I'm thinking what Jeremy said is like, I'm totally thinking like a designer. That is my hammer, and every problem is a design nail. So I do think that finding the right meeting cadence and what is critical for you is an iterative process, just like any other design problem. And you have to experiment to find out what your team's like unique communication needs are. But it's good to set an expectation that just because we're trying this now doesn't mean we have to do it this way forever. So you can kind of create some room for dissent and discussion by just having that, like you can do an asynchronous retrospective once per quarter and ask what should we be doing more of, less of, or keeping the same, what's working or not working or wasting our time. And through that process, adjust your meeting schedule accordingly. I have noticed one thing as a UX design practitioner, it's quite hard to articulate design rationale and defend content and interaction design decisions without like intentionally having a conversation with people. And I think that's because we create and present arguments through storytelling primarily. So when your partners and stakeholders kind of only see a prototype or a diagram in a vacuum, they're missing the thread of how those artifacts contribute to the larger story. So if you're just sending out a link to a prototype and asking for feedback, you might get some weird questions or like just general low-level thinking because all they can see is that, standalone screen. So I think a way around this is if you find you're giving the same response or kind of giving that same like message over and over, just record it as if giving a presentation and then share out the whole video. It's kind of like streaming a movie versus seeing a play. With a play, it runs for 8 weeks and then everyone's voice hurts. But with a movie, like all the actors get paid and everyone goes home, and then like consumers and audiences can rewatch it as many times as they need.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot add much. You have, of course, covered a lot of space already. I would definitely stress that it's important to iterate and experiment. I think in Automattic, a lot of the things are basically, there is a culture where a lot of the team level things are assumed to be experiments. So it's not even something that now I used to say or I used to stress. And of course, like finding the right communication way, it's super, super important. The only thing I would probably add a note on top is that I'm fairly, maybe a little too extreme sometimes in terms of going asynchronous as much as possible. So recorded videos, for example, are a good idea in that sense. And so on the other side, it means that when I do a meeting, so a call or something like that, it's usually mostly weighted on the social side of things. So of course, there are calls that are necessary. Oh, we need a clarification. Let's jump on a call straight off. That's useful, that works. All the others, like the routine weekly. So for example, we have a weekly chat with my team currently because we agreed that should be a good idea. And it's mostly time dedicated to talk to each other. There is a little bit at the beginning on what we worked on. Is there any blocker? But everything else, we try to make it as social as possible. Because I think exactly as you were saying, Jeremy, like the personal part needs to emerge. And it's great when it emerges with a video, with voice, with the tone, and everything. So yeah, I agreed all along with your opinions.
You're fine.
Can I add something to that, Suzanne? I think that one of the things that I think I bias towards, and this for sure, again, it's all an experiment, right? And I think it depends on the size of your organization. But one of the things that we've done is implement like explicit working hours, right? And this definitely wouldn't work at a company the size of Amazon because they're too distributed. There's too many people, very likely. But at a smaller scale, essentially enforcing that, hey, we have like 4 hours of overlap minimum during our working hours, which definitely shapes some of those things. So if at Automattic, for example, they're not doing that and you're like fully asynchronous, you're going to have some different patterns of behaviors and expectations there for sure. So I think that there's definitely some nuance in like, what are the cultural expectations of our types of communication in the type that we have. So like one of the things that will happen is if, for example, we do a lot in Slack. If I see somebody going back and forth in a thread and there's like essentially like, you know, more than 5 or 10 comments back and forth, I usually just drop in there and just like, hey, should we just jump on like a super quick call? Because probably we can get this done a lot faster in a 5-minute call versus a thread that asynchronously might take everyone 45 minutes back and forth like this. So things like that, I think, are like kind of like some slight rules that I've established with my team is like, hey, if you're having 5 or 10 back and forths, you should probably just jump on a phone call for 5 minutes and talk the thing out, and you'll get it figured out faster, things like that. But I think it's for sure, I think they're very much, I think it's nuanced based on the culture of your environment and what the team size is and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question, and then there's a few that have come in through the chat that I want to make sure we get to. This is an important one, though. How do you go about maintaining your sanity and avoiding team burnout when people are working around the clock? And Erin, I want to start with you because Automattic is a hugely distributed organization. What are some of the strategies you've seen people put into place to be able to manage that balance?
Yes, that's a very, very interesting as well as difficult question. One premise I need to make is that there are some elements in the culture and in the policies that Automattic has in place that help this. And one of these is we don't measure time. We don't have time off policies. So it's an open vacation policy, open time policy, which means that as long as you deliver results, it doesn't matter how you're doing that, right? I need to make this premise because then leads into the actual answer, which is everyone self-organizes the way they schedule their day or their week. For example, in the past, I used to work in a team, mostly in Europe, so almost the same time zone for everyone. Still, there were people that were like, I'm more efficient in the afternoon and the evening, so they start working at midday and going on for the rest of the day. That's totally fine. So giving a lot of autonomy allows people to find what works best for them and be flexible around it. And then there are a lot of strategies that different people, different individuals can take. So for example, a very simple one is just to start the day at whatever hour. If you think to work in like consecutive, for example, 8 hours, set an alarm or a timer saying, at this time I need to stop. And that sounds stupid in a way, but it's also important to be aware that in an office, you always know when it's the end of the day, because at some point you raise your head and everyone is gone. And so you're like, oh, maybe you should go home, Working distributedly, there is a constant flow of people coming online. So there has to be a lot of coping mechanisms that work for you, and there is no universal one as far as I know, that allow you to get through it and to manage it. So yeah, setting the timer is definitely one that works. Another one is, that I know some people use, is just at the end of each week, they review what the time investment and they try to balance off, or even day to day, like, oh, I worked 12 hours yesterday, tomorrow I'll start like 5 hours later, and that's fine, right? Or they end 5 hours later. So managing with time can be easy because it's kind of a static measure, so you don't feel too guilty if you try to stick to it. While there are, of course, if we say goal, it's a little trickier, because if the goal is not like set very explicitly and very narrowly for the week, there is always something to do. There is always something you can help with. There is always something. So yeah, whichever works, and there's probably one different solution for every automatician in the company.
Jeremy or Jared, do you have any specific strategies that you found work at your companies or for you and your teams?
I have some thoughts on some resources that I think it can be helpful for teams to read, and this will allow them to self-manage this a bit better. So the first is a book that's come out recently, is very popular right now. It's called Your Brain at Work.
Mm-hmm.
And takes an approach to the types of work that are the most mentally taxing, and the kinds that you can do when you have sort of like done all your context switching for the day and are running on limited resources. And so when you're sitting in office, that's kind of easier to do, because you say, oh, okay, I'll start my day with prioritization, and then I'll have a big block of uninterrupted, creative or writing thinking, and then I'm going to do all my meetings and stuff at the end of the day. But when you have a distributed team and people can be interrupting or randomizing you a little more than that, like, it comes down to setting an expectation that you're doing this kind of work at this time, and that you're going to be available to respond to those questions in 20 minutes or an hour or 3 hours. So a person knows that you're doing this at this time and you'll be available then, and if that doesn't work for them, they can potentially reach out to someone else. But I think the other thing that I've seen be so important for helping teams avoid burnout is this idea of the SCARF model. Is something that helps people feel more comfortable and relaxed in a work situation, so their brain isn't constantly going into anxiety mode or stress or worrying about productivity. And the SCARF model, it's the SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And when people feel that they have these things or have a balance of these things, they're less likely to get anxious. And anxiety is a big driver of burnout, because you're just constantly concerned if you're making a difference or not.
Sure.
Love that. Love it. I have a slightly different thing that's in this the same topic, but I noticed, I say this because it's something I've shared with my team members, and I've seen other people do this in terms of remote. So I can sometimes get anxious, and I wouldn't say that like I deal with necessarily anxiety and depression, but like I can for sure get anxious. And I think we have to know ourselves and like what fuels us. So one of the things is, I would not call myself an extrovert. I'm about midway between introvert and extrovert, but I do like to be around people. When I first started working fully remotely, I was like, this is awesome. I just work from my house all the time. And after about 6 months, I started to feel like anxious and depressed. And it took me a while to figure out what was happening. And then as an engineer, I thought, well, I want to work at my house because I have 2 monitors and I'm more efficient. And I actually had to think through my brain, because at least at Envision, where I worked at the time, they gave us like a coffee card so we could go and work at coffee shops, essentially. Like they gave us like an allowance for that. But I had to mentally go like, even though I might be a little less productive not having 2 monitors for a few hours if I go work at a coffee shop, if I ultimately burn out and quit, that's also not to Envision's advantage, right? Like I literally had to do that math in my head and eventually go, okay, it's okay to go to Starbucks and work for half the day, even though I only have 1 monitor. I know some people will go to co-located workspaces. That's another option as well. But like for me, so I tell my people like, look, you need to go do work where is going to be most effective for you, but also know yourself and sense yourself. And if you need to be around people, even if it's a bit louder, or those things, like I'll share some tools with you to help with that, but like go and do that, because ultimately I want you to be happy and healthy and successful for the long term, not for 2 months or 3 months. So I think, like, for sure, understanding yourself and what you need to do and where you need to work to be happy and healthy over a long term is really important, and making people feel okay with doing the things that they need to do to be successful in that is really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think something that I campaign for that is somewhat controversial and gets obviously like a strong reaction from people is, I think people should take Slack off their phones. I took Slack off my phone. It made the biggest difference in terms of my stress management, and my focus when I was actually focused on the work at hand, the ability to tackle problems and have a higher quality of output. I'm not trying to do the work on my phone, responding to things as they come in, feeling like I needed to respond to things in the moment. It's really hard for people to get on board with that idea. There's a level of guilt, like, well, what if somebody needs me at 11:30 p.m. and I am not immediately available? Yes, that's the perfect emoji. But you work long, hard days, and you don't need to be taking Slack to bed with you at night. And I feel this is one of the biggest tips I can give somebody on a distributed team is only show up to your Slack conversations when you're truly ready to take on the work, when you're present, and you'll find that your work is not only higher quality, but also you tend to have better relationships with your coworkers. You don't start to resent people for sending you messages at weird hours or on Sunday afternoons. It's not in your control when people are getting their work done. If people want to get work done and send you messages on Sunday afternoons, it shouldn't be overwhelming for you as the recipient of these messages. Is that something that you guys think you could do? Remove these things from your phones? I'm always curious to hear people's reactions.
So I have Slack on my phone, but I don't have notifications on.
Mm-hmm.
So like I have it so that I can go there when I want to go there, but not so that people ping me. So
that's a good first step.
I don't have Slack on my phone, and I also don't have email on my phone, but it's just because I switched to an iPhone from an Android and I haven't set it up yet. But
Okay.
but it's like, it's been a nice, month of not having it there. I can kind of see the value there in not always being available.
Yeah, similar. I don't know if it's on, because I need to install when we go to meetups. So sometimes I install it and remove it. But even when it's installed, it's always notifications of everything off.
Good. Okay. I'm just curious. All right. So we have 10 minutes left. I want to get a couple questions answered that have come in through Q&A. I think this one is a good place to start. So have you noticed distributed colleagues having different rhythms or moods or different energies of people when they're in different time zones? So how do you approach daily meetings or schedules when some people have just had their first cup of coffee and other people are about to sign off for dinner? Anyone want to jump in on that one? Erin?
I feel I've partially already answered, in the sense that our calls tend to be more social.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, absolutely. That's something that happens all the time. Some meetings, for example, we organize them. So the recording ones, we alternate time zones. So some are easier for some people, and then the next week they're harder for them, and then it gets easier. So you get some alternation that can help. But in general, yes, it's just something that we acknowledge. And that's actually one of the reasons why, again, I prefer asynchronous text-based, because then you can wait the moment where you are focused and productive and answer at that moment.
And I think a follow-up to that, and relevant to what we were just talking about with avoiding burnout, is how do you know when your people are overloaded? As a manager, how do you protect your people when teams are asked to continuously do more, better, and faster?
I saw something so interesting this week at a design conference, and it was this idea that workers tend to have one of 5 different kinds of insecurities. So probably everyone's heard of imposter syndrome, but there are some other types too, like expert syndrome or Superman or Superwoman syndrome. And it's the idea that, you know, some people account for their insecurities by staying later and working more. Some people feel like they're phonies, so they're constantly doing more trainings or learning new skills or being on the edge of something. And other people feel like, you know, whatever it is. And I think one way that managers can get to know their team is to kind of assess for that and find out what your individual teammates' insecurities are, so that when you see that behavior being exhibited, the key behavior that indicates they're leaning in on that insecurity, you kind of notice it and you can kind of start to manage around it, because somebody who's engaging in that insecure behavior for an extended period of time is more likely to be at risk for burnout. To the previous question, I also think that something I've kind of learned from reading the Your Brain at Work book is that even when everyone is co-located, people are going to have these different moods or different rhythms in the day. And it kind of comes down to how much their mental resources have been taxed up to that point. So normally, you know, I might be really collaborative around lunchtime, but if I've had a particularly rough morning, like that's just going to be burnt out. And letting people surface that, creating an environment that is safe to say, you know what, I have already done all my best thinking today, and I just don't think we're going to get, you know, more from this. It's kind of like creating space for people to tell you what they need in this regard.
Regarding the how do you help your team essentially be effective and you know, not be overloaded, I think the first thing is like a general thing, which sadly doesn't happen all the time in organizations I've seen, is consistent feedback for how people are doing. And I think that when we think about like anxiety and things like that, high performing individuals, which are the people that I want to work with and the people that I hire, desire feedback, right? Like not just because they want to know that they're not doing the job, actually in the opposite, they want to know, how do I get better at my job? Like, how do I continue to be more effective and grow? And that requires a manager actually like watching and spending focus and energy thinking about behaviors and actions and things like this, and giving feedback and setting a clear framework for what are your expectations and how are they performing within those things. I have found that generally when you have the human connection, when you are doing things as a team and you are giving consistent feedback, you have less of people feeling like showing those symptoms of feeling overloaded, right? And when you do, then I think like Jira said, it's like, okay, I'm observing something. Tell me about how you show up under stress, right? Like, tell me about how you feel when like what behaviors do you exhibit? Like, I know some engineers get super focused and they essentially go deep and start shutting off communications. Like, that's a great thing to know, right? Like if you're tending to show those behaviors, you know, what are things that you can do? Like, you know, is it okay to go out and ask for support, ask for help? These things, like, how can you begin to do this? So I think like the first thing is are we setting clear expectations? Are we giving consistent feedback? And then as a manager, are we paying attention to people's behaviors and signals and asking those questions like it was shared, so that we can understand and help them to like understand and work through those things?
Yeah, it's an interesting point about feedback, and feedback being a way to manage stress and anxiety and uncertainty. I mean, either way, whatever type of feedback it is, it's better than nothing. I know it's something that I've talked about with my manager. It is an interesting transition when you start to give, let's say, presentations of your work on a distributed team, and you say, here it is, here's how it's going, here's what I think, and then everyone logs off. And immediately you're alone in your living room and you're like, I wonder how that went. And a lot of the times when you're co-located, you get that feedback after the meeting has wrapped up. You bump into someone in the hallway and you say, how did you think it went? What do you think? And you get the feedback maybe from your manager just walking to lunch afterwards. It's a little bit more informal sometimes. So it's important to create those sort of hallway conversations in some kind of back channel as a manager, where you're saying, you know, this went well, here are the things I think, and being proactive about that, because otherwise you don't get it sometimes. and there's less opportunities to just bump into somebody who's, you know, filling up their water bottle at the same time and chat with them. So we have 3 more minutes. I want to ask this one question because I think it's really interesting. And then any other questions, hopefully at least you, Jeremy, will have a few minutes to jump in on the AMA channel and Slack. But the last one here is interviewing. We talked about feedback and performance management and culture building as part of team management and leadership, but so is hiring. This is a big part of being a leader. What does the interview process look like at your companies, and how have you adapted it for hiring people who would be effective on remote teams?
I can answer. I mean, I cannot answer on the adapted part because we have always been fully distributed. But I can say that there are a few things that we do. Like anything specifically talking about remote work, some of the steps are generally understandable for every kind of hiring. So you do an interview, and in our case, we do a text interview, for example, because in that way, again, you practice how we usually work in the context. So people are invited, for example, to our Slack instance and so on. But also one of the things we do is we have a mini trial that is set up to be, first it's paid trial. So we pay a rate. Of course, it's a standard rate, but that's something. And it's scoped down to be as small as possible. So it's doable in about 20 hours or so. And we're trying to shorten it actually. And the other thing is then you manage it as much as you want. Like 20 hours, if you want to pull all that in 3 days because you want to take 1 day holiday and do it through the weekend, that's fine. If you want to spread it along, for example, my trial went along, I think 2 months overall, because I was doing a little bit at a time. I was posting, I was writing up what I was doing. And I'm highlighting this specific step of all our hiring process because it happened that a few people during this trial, which emulates as much as we can how we work, some people were like, you know what, I cannot work in this way. Like, it's great, I love your company, the project seems fine, but it doesn't really work. So it wasn't us rejecting them, it was them understanding that that's not a way I can work going forward. And that's totally fine. Like, it's easy for us because we are always been distributed, so we didn't have the disruption in changing modus operandi for a lot of people. But I think that the trial specifically is one of the key elements in our hiring process to be able to assess.
Got it. All right, well, we're right at time. Thank you all so much for all of your amazing insights and your input today. And thanks again for joining.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
It was awesome.
Thanks so much.